Hey, church family, we're continuing on with our parable study. I have really enjoyed telling and listening to stories most of my life. That was an era, especially for those for the purpose of life. I grew up in an era where stories were shared by our parents and to each other in our classrooms, and we just conveyed that way. I used to tell stories to my little brothers, which kept them occupied while my mother worked. But the greatest storyteller of all is Jesus. And we call them parables. Why did Jesus tell these parables? I think it's important that we understand, why did he tell so many? We need to realize they were given as a mirror to produce self-understanding and to understand who God is. Not just who we are, but who is God. Our ways are not his ways. So let's look at ourselves if we dare. If you dare say, see myself in this parable. As our society moves increasingly away from our biblical roots, we seem to fill in the place that is reserved for God with that word called self. Values are determined by such ideas as loving yourself is the greatest love of all. I need to feel good about myself. I owe it to myself. I even had a lady tell me that one time in a crisis in my life. And she said, you owe it to yourself, Jean. Go do this. And it wasn't the right thing to do. But the world is looking at it that way. Humanism, New Age says, find the God within you. There is not a God out there. Discover you and the awesome power of self. We have preachers today who say, your problem's not sin or rebellion against God, but it's a loss of self-esteem. And when we start thinking that way, church, thus self begins to replace God. And that's what we have going. In Luke 18, 9 through 14, Jesus told this parable. And it goes like this. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector standing over here. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, Jesus goes on in this parable to say, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, what all does that mean? You know, in each generation, we get labeled something. We've had, back in my parents' time, would have been the Depression era. We've got the baby boomers. We've got the Generation X. We've got Generation Y. And that's kind of in the alphabet, and that's a little scary. But now, we're typically known as the me generation, and that's rightly named. They say, they, meaning the world, the most common error in people's self-imaging is really low self-esteem. That's all it is. But could it be self-serving pride? They say it's not an inferiority complex, but could it be a superiority complex? Are we needing to be more than what we are? Our flesh tells us, trust your feelings. Secular humanism tells us, trust the God within. But here's a new word for you, and it's called selfism, selfism. You know, in Pastor Tim's sermon last Sunday, in the drive-in service, he quoted that scripture, in the latter days, man will become lover of self. And that's so true, because that goes back to what we're called today, the me generation. And did you know, this is a fact that's being written about us, that they're saying that this generation right now, history scholars are writing about us as they have every generation. You go back and you see the culture and what they've done. But what they're saying about us is we are the most anxiety-ridden, emotionally insecure, and abusive society in human history. Now think about that one more time. Anxiety-ridden, emotionally insecure, and abusive society in human history. That means self has been placed on the throne where only God belongs. And that's what we've done. We've become lovers of self. Now let's go back to the parable and let's look at the Pharisee in our parable. What kind of man was he? He was religious. He was committed to upright behavior, religious tradition, highly respected by the public and in the temple. But here's a man, as you listen to that prayer, he was praying about himself or to himself. Here's a man with an I problem. Me, myself, and I. His focus was on what he did, not on what he was. Conduct, not character. How many times have you prayed and when you got through it was, God, I'm this and I do this right and I do that right, and you start laying out to God how good you are when the whole time he already knows. What's your character? Now here comes the other person in this parable into the temple, a tax collector. He's polar opposite of the Pharisee. He was considered a traitor to the Jews, classed with robbers by the righteous, shunned by the respectable, and he stands at the distance, and his eyes, you can just see him. His eyes are downcast. His body language is full of guilt. But he has no illusions about who he is, not any. His prayer is a cry of the heart. Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He knows that God doesn't forgive excuses, only sins. Here's a man who can see nothing in himself but seeks God's atoning mercy. Now Jesus goes to the end of this parable in God's courtroom, and make no mistake, everything will wind up in God's courtroom. And the last word comes out in verse 14. I tell you that this man, and he's talking about the tax collector, rather than the other man, which is the Pharisee, went home justified before God. Now think about that carefully. Justified. Did the tax collector go home and say, oh, I was humble enough and I've repented enough and I've did what I should do, so I'm justified? But when you look up the word justified, biblically it means declared righteous. And only God the judge did this in view of Christ's death on the cross. That's the only way we can be declared righteous. So the Pharisee was wasting his time. His religion was empty. His prayers were futile. His boasting was foolish. Because the Lord said, he who humbles himself will be exalted. If you go to Matthew 5, which is the Beatitudes, and you read verse 3, it says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, poor in spirit means, if you look in the King James, those who have genuine sorrow for their sins. So read that again. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for those who have genuine sorrow. For this is the kingdom of heaven. That we've repented genuinely, that we're not righteously lifting up and thinking that we're going to pull it off, because we're not. So when you examine yourself, do you seek fulfillment, self? Is it all about me? Or do you see yourself in the light of God's forgiveness and know that declared righteousness only comes through the cross? Examine yourself. Thank you.